All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining our webinar, What to Do with Your Inheritance. My name is Katie Bruno, and today I'm joined by Michael Morey and Ben Hoy, and we are financial advisors at Morey & Quinn Wealth Partners, located in Omaha, Nebraska. We are passionate about people, we're passionate about their money, and we love working alongside our clients as we get to know you and create a financial plan that's designed for your success. In today's webinar, we're going to be talking about inheritances. And over time, it's estimated that $68 trillion worth of assets is going to pass down from the baby boomers to the younger generations, and that's over the next 25 years. Many people that are going to receive this wealth are not going to know how to put that money to good use. And when you come into financial windfall, you're going to have a lot of questions to deal with. And so what we'd like to do today is create a thoughtful conversation around these questions. The implications of receiving an inheritance, the implications of managing an inheritance. I'm going to start by discussing, evaluating where you are today. And then Mike's going to walk us through prioritizing your financial goals and the importance of creating a plan for the wealth that you have just stepped into. And then Ben is going to talk about some of the things that you can do with your inheritance, including investing it and some of the implications with different assets that you have received. And then I will wrap us up today by talking about the importance of building your financial team. So the first thing, take a breath. Here's the deal. When a loved one dies, you're not thinking clearly enough to make financial decisions. And the good news is, in most cases, you don't have to make any financial decisions right away. There's nothing wrong with letting your inheritance or money you have received sit there for a while as you grieve and process the loved one that you just lost. So take a breath, go slow. Next thing is knowing your numbers. And when I'm talking about knowing your numbers, I'm talking about creating a baseline for where you are today. And in other words, what's the starting point and where are the gaps? So it's kind of creating a cash flow statement or a budget and creating a net worth statement. So when we talk about cash flow and budgets, we're talking about money that's coming in or going out during a certain period of time. This is your income and this is your expenses. You need to start by thinking about what are your needs and what are your wants when you create your budget. We have needs, we have living expenses. These are the basic bare bones of your budget: your housing, your food, a car, and then you have your discretionary expenses. And those are things like travel or new furniture or paying down debt, things that may not be necessary, but you want to have. So that's what we call your cash flow statement or your budget. The next thing is your net worth statement. And the net worth statement is your assets that you own, so what you have minus what you owe, so your debt. Your assets minus your liabilities. When we talk about your assets, we're talking about your bank accounts, your investments, your retirement accounts, your house or real estate you may own, jewelry, insurance cash values. And when we talk about your liabilities, we're talking about credit cards, mortgages, student loans, and then sometimes you may have a short-term debt, something like credit cards, or a long-term debt like mortgages. So those are your liabilities. So take a look at where you are, calculate your net worth, because this is going to be a quick snapshot of your current financial life. And a financial advisor can help you create both of those statements. So receiving an inheritance from a family member should be a blessing, but all too often it becomes a curse. According to a study, 70% of family money disappears by the second generation and 90% by the third generation. So some people actually see their wealth decrease after they inherit a financial windfall. As financial advisors, we've seen far too many people get an inheritance and then throw it all away. They go on a few vacations, they buy a fancy new car, and before they know it, the money that they have is gone and they have nothing to show for it. So we want to start by talking about that budget and that net worth statement, and then talking about your financial goals, which Mike is going to talk about here in a little bit, because what we need to do is be intentional with our money and think about putting some of the money that you've just inherited towards eliminating debt or funding your retirement or paying off a mortgage. When you receive an inheritance, you have the potential to change your family tree forever. So we need to make it count. And now we're going to talk about taxes, and things definitely get complicated when it comes to taxes associated with an inheritance, but try to stick with me here. So federal estate tax. Federal estate tax is a tax that's on the transfer of a person's property after their death. Federal estate tax is only assessed on estates that are worth more than $11,700,000. Now, when a person passes away, things go to their estate if they do not have beneficiaries listed. So when it comes to retirement accounts, if somebody has an IRA or a 401k and they have someone listed as a beneficiary, that beneficiary gets the money, not the estate. Same with life insurance policies. If you inherit money from a life insurance policy because you are the beneficiary listed on the life insurance policy, that does not go to the estate. When things are not listed or beneficiaries are not listed on assets, those assets go to an estate. Now, typically you're going to hire an estate planning attorney to help you go through this process. And they are going to help you determine what needs to be done according to what the will of the person who passed away says, or if there wasn't a will, according to how things should be distributed due to the state law. So things are compiled, they're put onto an estate balance sheet, and then depending on the value of the estate, an estate tax is calculated. And the estate is responsible for the taxes. So the estate would pay the taxes before any beneficiaries would receive their share of the inheritance. Now, so as an inheritor, you would not be responsible for estate taxes. But inheritance taxes are different. Inheritance taxes are imposed once you receive the money, and it's based on the amount of money you received. And different states have different laws around this. 6 states currently have an inheritance tax, and Nebraska is one of those states that does have an inheritance tax. It depends on what your situation, so it's really important that you involve a tax professional and an estate planning attorney, because depending on your association with the person that you inherited, you may be exempt from even paying this tax. And when it comes to taxes, it's really easy to get in over your head really fast. And like I said, that's why you should work with a tax professional or an accountant and an estate planning attorney. And now I'm going to pass it on to Mike, where he is going to talk about prioritizing your financial goals and what some of those goals might look like.
Thanks, Katie. So you've inherited some money. That can be daunting. And as Katie said before, the first thing to do is take a deep breath, take a step back, and let's prioritize what your financial goals are. And it's important to remember that this is a marathon, not a sprint. No decisions need to be made, as soon as possible in the next 24 hours. It's important to lay everything out and make decisions based on the information you've gathered. So what are your financial goals? The first goal should be to put this inherited money somewhere safe, somewhere it's not exposed to market risk, market fluctuations. This could be something like a savings account at the bank, a money market, or even certificates of deposit, CDs, that can be FDIC insured. And it's important to remember with CDs that there's a limit that you can put into a CD at each bank in order for them to be FDIC insured. And that's $250,000 per person per bank. So what that means is if you inherit more than $250,000, you can put that all into a CD, but only $250,000 can go into each individual bank. You can go to different banks and use different CDs, but it's important to remember that. The important thing when you're putting this money somewhere safe is that it's liquid. You can get to it if you need to, and it's safe. You're not going to expose it to any market risk. The second step is to look at your financial situation. Do you have any high interest debt? This could be things like credit card bills, student loans. I'm not talking about the mortgage on your house because your house is considered an investment. You intend to sell that at a later date for profit. But with things like credit card debt and student loans, it's important to get those paid off as soon as possible. Because one of the biggest keys to becoming financially successful is to live debt-free. So part of your goal of what you should be doing with this inheritance is to be doing whatever you can to pay off that high interest debt as soon as you can. And what that will do is free up some cash flow of what you would normally be using to make payments on those credit cards or student loan debt. The third step in prioritizing your financial goals is to build an emergency savings fund or a rainy day fund. Most experts say you should have anywhere between 3 to 6 months worth of living expenses set aside for emergency savings. Now, that's all. Everybody's different. Everybody has a different goal of what they want put away for savings. Some people feel more comfortable and can sleep better at night if they've got, say, 7 or 8 months of savings set aside. But that's up to you. That's a personal decision. But I would recommend at least having 3 months worth of savings set aside, because we all know life happens, right? There might be a medical emergency. You might get laid off from your job. There might be, the furnace at home breaks. You've got to replace that. Life happens. So it's important to have an emergency savings set aside so that we're not having to use credit cards and build up debt in order to deal with life's emergencies. The fourth step is to enjoy some of it, right? Some parents have a goal to leave money for their heirs, for their children. And so it's important to remember to enjoy it. It's a blessing. And while, we need to take the steps in place to make sure we're using the money appropriately, take a trip that you've been planning to take but haven't had the means to do so, or finish a home project that you've been working on. Another idea might be to open up a 529 college savings account for your kids. That's a great gift. I'm sure college isn't cheap these days, and it's only getting more expensive. So that might be a great use for some of that money. The important thing is to live within your means. Enjoy it within your means. Do it practically and wisely. Have a plan, have a budget, and know what you're spending. But like I said, it's a blessing. You should be able to enjoy some of it, but do it prudently and within your means. And the fifth step is gifting. Maybe you have a charity, a nonprofit, or a church that you're passionate about. You might consider gifting some of your inheritance to one of those nonprofits. Or maybe, if your inheritance was from your parents, maybe they had a nonprofit that they were passionate about or were involved with. Or maybe they were active members of their church. Gifting money to one of these organizations is a great way to do so in their honor or in remembrance of your parents or grandparents or who you've inherited this money for. The important thing with all of this, though, is to, like I said, take a deep breath, lay out a game plan, create goals. Like I said, it's a marathon. It's not a sprint. and make sure that you gather all the information necessary before you make any decisions when you receive this inheritance. What if you inherit real estate? What if your parents or grandparents, whoever it may be, left you, let's say, a home? You've inherited their home. Well, there's some options involved with what to do with that inheritance. And again, it's important to ask questions and gather information before you make any of these decisions. The first option to do with the real estate is to simply sell it. Okay. Well, what are some questions to ask if you're considering selling the home? First one might be, is there a mortgage or a lien on the property still? If you sold the home, how much of the proceeds from the sale of that house is going to go towards paying off that mortgage or lien? That's something important to know before selling the home. What about capital gains if you were to sell the home? And capital gains is a fancy term for profit. So for example, let's say your parents bought a home 15 years ago for $200,000. And then while they were still alive, they decided to sell the home for $300,000. Well, their capital gains or profit would be that difference of $100,000 between $300,000 and $200,000. They would owe capital gains tax potentially on that profit. However, since you've inherited this real estate, the rules are a little bit different. There is an exemption to capital gains that you might be eligible for. If you're a single tax filer and you're eligible, you could be exempt up to $250,000 worth of capital gains on the sale of that property. If you're married and filing jointly and you're eligible, you could be exempt for up to $500,000 of capital gains on that property. So that's a big deal. However, there's a catch. In order to be eligible for that exemption, you must move in and live in that residence for at least 2 years in order to be eligible for that capital gains exemption. So that's something to consider. Are you willing to move into that house or that residence for at least 2 years in order to be eligible for that capital gains exemption? However, most individuals, not all, but most individuals won't need to take that into account, that exemption, due to something called the step up in cost basis. So what's the step up in cost basis? What this means is that if your parents bought the home for $200,000 and at the time they died, the fair market value of that home was $300,000, the cost basis gets stepped up to the fair market value at the time of their death. So now your initial cost basis is now $300,000 instead of the original $200,000 that your parents paid for. So that's a huge benefit when it comes to capital gains. So ultimately, if you receive the step up in cost basis and you decide to sell the home, so let's say the fair market value at the time of their death was $300,000, you ultimately sell the house and sell it for $305,000. Ultimately, your capital gains exposure is only that $5,000 difference between $300,000 and $305,000. Now, with all that being said, it's important before you do anything to talk to a tax professional like a CPA to really get information and make informed decisions before doing anything. The second option would be to rent the home. Maybe you need an additional stream of income. This could be a source for that, is simply renting out the home. However, there's some questions to ask and to consider before doing that. Are you willing and able to take on the ongoing maintenance of that home and for the taxes associated with owning that home? What if the furnace breaks? Do you have an emergency fund set aside to replace that furnace in the rental home? So there's a lot of responsibilities involved with renting the home that you need to be aware of and be willing to take on if you decide to rent the home. And ultimately, is it worth it? Is the cost of the ongoing maintenance and the taxes worth the benefit of the income stream that you might receive from renting the home? So lots of things to consider before deciding to rent the home. It's a lot of responsibility. And lastly, maybe you want to live in the home. You know, a lot of people have a dream of moving in and living in their parents' home after they're gone. Maybe it's your childhood home that you have a lot of memories with, a lot of nostalgia that you always wanted to raise your family in. That's a real possibility and real reality for a lot of people. But some things to consider are, you know, is there still a mortgage or a lien on the property? Are you prepared to take on that debt, the mortgage or the lien on the house? And again, home ownership responsibilities. Are you prepared to deal with the upkeep and the financial responsibilities of that upkeep? Do you have an emergency fund set aside for, you know, replacing a new roof, or, you know, replacing the air conditioning unit? Maybe your parents' home is an older home. Maybe they've lived in it for a long time, and it requires more upkeep than, you know, say a new home would. All things to consider when deciding to live in the home. And lastly, capital gains. If you decide to move in and live in the home and then ultimately sell the house down the road, what are the tax implications involved with that? You know, there could potentially be capital gains involved with selling that home. And like I've said, a broken record, before you make any decisions, it's vitally important that you gather a team of individuals, professionals like a CPA, an accountant, and a financial advisor to really help you make informed decisions before you jump in feet first. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Ben to talk about the different investment accounts that might be available to you and for your inheritance.
Right. Yeah. Thanks, Mike and Katie. So we've identified that, you know, at the point of inheriting assets or funds from whether it be a parent or other relative, it can come in many forms. Real estate, obviously, retirement accounts are going to be a common one.
Okay, well, thanks, Mike and Katie. I appreciate that. And I also apologize for the little interruption with the audio issue, but continuing on, yeah, there are a lot of ways that somebody may inherit accounts and funds from loved ones. Obviously, we had just spoke about real estate. Another very common way of receiving inheritance is through a retirement account. Many people are able to contribute to these over the years, and they're a great way to accumulate assets and grow wealth. So they're broken down into two basic categories. You know, you have your traditional IRA, 401k, 403b, and then you have the Roth IRA, Roth 401k. The big difference here is that the traditional accounts, really they're partnered up with the federal government. So you have that Uncle Sam there as your silent partner, and at some point in time, you know, they're going to want their cut. So, you know, the idea here is to identify possible differentiation or within the location of some of your assets. So a Roth IRA, for example, is going to be a great source to continue to receive that deferred growth within the account, but they'll be able to be tax-free when the time of withdrawal comes. So there's a lot of different rules that are in place between these two accounts, but the basic principle here is that one is pre-taxed and one is not. So when we're looking at the traditional IRA, and when we look at you know, the most common vehicle for accumulating assets and wealth, you'll see that these tend to be a popular choice, and rightfully so. They're a great source for you know, being able to contribute tax-free and pre-tax, and then being able to grow tax-deferred with the thought that, you know, when retirement comes, we'll pay the income tax, and, you know, they serve their purpose very well in that sense. But a recent legislation that passed, actually it was back in December of 2019 now, it's called the Secure Act. When this law came into effect, actually there was President Trump's first impeachment was taking place, so that got most of the headlines, and the Secure Act really just kind of made it through with little to no fanfare. And most of this legislation was actually very good. A lot of it focused on small businesses and allowing them to come together to offer their employees better retirement benefits. So Like I said, a lot of it was very good. You may have even heard that there was a change to the required minimum distribution age. It was 70 and a half, bumped it up to 72, allowing some of the people who maybe didn't want to take those distributions to delay that a bit. And then the other thing that I wanted to share with you today that impacts the inheritance, the person receiving the accounts at the transfer of assets, is previously, and I'll use an example here. Let's say you have an 80-year-old parent who passes away, and for a nice round number, we'll say it's $1 million in an IRA, and you receive that. Prior to the Secure Act, you could take distributions out over a stretched period of time, maybe 25, 30 years, taking a smaller amount out and being able to then only increase your income, a small amount, not necessarily impacting the tax bracket that you're currently in. So maybe you're able to take those distributions out around 15% or so. The new law actually is going to state that you'll have to liquidate those assets over the course of 10 years. And of course, that's going to require a larger annual distribution, which is potentially going to bump you into a higher tax bracket. Long story short, there's not much you can do about it at this point. It's just to be aware that this rule does now exist. So somebody who's 80, 85, and they've thought, oh, my traditional IRA is a great source for accumulating wealth and assets, and it's going to be able to transfer to my children, with that stretch policy. Now, would have to consider the fact that instead of their children maybe receiving, $850,000, it might be closer to $700,000. So, if legacy planning is something that's important and it's something to consider when you're receiving, but it's also something to consider as a long-term plan for yourself. When you're saving at a younger age, you have the ability to create those different locations for the assets now. Whereas, like I said, when somebody who's maybe 85 and 90 and they've put 95% of their assets into these vehicles, their options are a little bit more limited at that time. So that's something we can talk about here. Actually, if we go to the next screen, is when we're looking at, actually that's good, options for investing. So this is where, and I know that Mike and Katie both referenced the fact that, you want to have a plan in place and identifying, where you're at in your life. Maybe you do have some debt, and that's going to be your main focus. Wiping out your debt and then getting the emergency savings. If you get these things in place, and then you're looking, okay, now I've done that. What do I do with the remaining amount? Hopefully you find yourself in that spot. It's a good spot to be in. So at that point, what we would want to do is really sit down and reflect on, like what Katie was saying about needs and wants, and maybe even look at wishes, and identifying, what's most important to you, and what would make the most sense based on time horizons, risk tolerance, the diversification that you're looking for within those assets and their location. So maxing out retirement savings very well could be the best avenue for you to go, depending on where you're at. Maybe you're at the point where you're already retired and you're receiving the assets, or a college savings for a child or grandchild. That might also be a great place to put some of the assets, again, just depending on your specific situation. Real estate can be a very effective tool for providing some of that diversification. But again, liquidity needs are something to consider here, as well as risk tolerance. So you may have found yourself also maybe receiving some of the inheritance in the form of a life insurance tax-free death benefit. At these trying times when you may have lost a loved one and you're going through these difficult decisions, you may have found yourself really finding comfort in the fact that a life insurance is very easy and straightforward. You know, a couple weeks after you've received this terrible news, you receive a check, and it's something that you can use to, you know, help with funeral costs and all the other difficult things that are going on in your life at that point in time. You may have found yourself really appreciating that. And at this point now, you know, if you do have the means to support a life insurance policy for yourself, that might be something to consider as well. So, and then, Kate, if we could go to the previous screen, I wanted to just piggyback on what Mike was saying about real estate when it comes to things like receiving maybe sports cars or family heirlooms, such as you know, maybe your grandma's diamond ring. So some of these items can have a lot of value, but they also can have some sentimental value. So you may find yourself in a situation where you know, you feel like, oh, this diamond ring from grandma's so valuable, but it also means so much to me that I have it. I want to leave it to my daughter and have my daughter leave it to her daughter. But you know, you may find yourself in a situation where you inherit a lot of things. So, you know, you might be in a spot where you may want to reach out to an estate liquidation company, or where you might get some assistance with determining which items in here actually may be appreciating in value. So, you know, if you get the sedan that your family member was driving around in, and, you know, it's you know, your standard form of transportation, that car likely is depreciating, not really something that we would be focusing on here. Let's say if it were a 1963 Corvette, you know, a really nice show car, and maybe that was bought in 1970 for $10,000. Today it's worth $100,000, and in 10 years from now it might be worth $150,000. So that would be considered an asset. The same way it would work very similar to what Mike was mentioning with real estate. So there'd be that same step up in basis and some of the same decisions and thought process. Obviously, you wouldn't have as much upkeep and those kinds of things to consider, but there's the sentimental value and you know, considering the fact that it is an asset and it does appreciate. So there might be a time, and again, no quick decisions would need to be made here, but it would make some sense to utilize some step up in basis possibly to sell some of these items. And just another thing to consider when you're looking at the assets that can come at that time. All right, Katie, now I do think that we did cover the next one, so we may be moving on to the building of the team. You know, we were just talking about how, you know, identifying the individual's wishes and what's most important to them is going to really be the major factor when determining next steps and how to invest. But obviously having the right people around them is going to be very important. So I'll let Katie tell us a little bit more about that.
Yep, thank you, Ben. And so the next step would be to really build your team. And you are the center of your own life. And there are going to be many different professionals that come into your life at different times during your life. You usually do not need the same professionals throughout your entire life. And so when you are going through receiving an inheritance, these are some of the professionals that come to my mind that you may need to engage. Maybe a little bit biased here, but I do think one of the most important is the financial advisor. And I say that because we are the one who is going to help you across your lifetime. And we're going to be able to help you coordinate with these other specialists. Maybe you only need the estate planning attorney when you're dissolving your grandma's estate or when you're creating your own estate plan. Same with a real estate agent. It's a transactional business. But as a financial advisor, we're here and we can help you pull all these different parts of your financial life together and create a plan. So when you're choosing a professional, do your homework, meet with them, ask them about their philosophies, their services, how do they get paid? It's a very personal process, and this is your money. So it really should be a two-way fit between you and any professional that you are using. And lastly, I'm going to open it up for questions here in a minute, but I wanted to thank you all for attending. I've listed our emails here. All of us would be happy to take any of your questions via email. You can call our office. We're always happy to help with any questions that you might have, or if something came up that we said and you want more info. So now I'm going to go ahead and open it up for questions. And it looks like we did have one come in, and this one is for Mike, and it's about debt. I have a mortgage loan that is a really low interest rate, 2.5%. I'd really like to pay off my mortgage for peace of mind, but not sure if investing the money makes sense. Can you talk a little bit about that? That one's for you, Mike.
That's a great question. We get that a lot, and we see it not only with inheritance, but when people are approaching retirement as well. One of the first things they want to do is, take a big lump sum either out of an inheritance or, in cases of retirement, their 401k, and pay off the mortgage. They don't want to have that debt anymore. They don't want to have the mortgage payment every month. It's kind of out of sight, out of mind. You don't have to worry about it anymore. So that's a common question. But what we really kind of look at is if you have a low interest rate on that, like say 2.5%, would that money be better used putting it to work where you could potentially earn a higher interest rate? So for example, if it's only 2.5%, but we can get, say, on average 6-7% by investing it appropriately, then it might be the case. Our recommendation would be to, keep making that mortgage payment, and that money would be better used more prudently by putting it to work and earning a higher interest elsewhere. And there's been multiple cases with our clients where we've actually taken that money, invested it appropriately, and actually made the mortgage payment for them with that investment. Again, because we can get a higher interest rate potentially in the market and help to make that mortgage payment for the individual. But that's a very common question, and it's good. There's no real right or wrong answer, but remember that once you take that lump sum and pay off the mortgage, that money is gone theoretically until you one day sell that house and then receive the payment from the sale of the house. So lots of things to consider. Great question. And if that comes up, it's important to sit down with an advisor and really talk that out and see what's most appropriate for you.
Yep, thanks for that, Mike. And I'll just add to that sometimes it's not even mortgages we're talking about, it's student loans. Do I pay off my student loans? In a very similar conversation. Looks like we had one other question come in, and this one's for Ben. You talk about maxing out your retirement savings. Will this help my tax situation? How much can I put away?
Well, when you're looking at what's going to be the best option for you, when you're, you've got this lump sum and you're saying to yourself, which avenue is going to be best? The idea of maxing out your retirement funds could be something that you would do that 1 year, which probably would make some sense. But again, this is something where you'd want to sit down with an advisor and really have a conversation about what's most important to you, what kind of goals do you have, again, how close are you to retirement, what sort of time horizons are we looking at, and determining if it is the best option for you. So because of the limitations for annual contributions to whether it be a traditional or Roth IRA, you may find yourself just maxing out in 2021, and then maybe you'd have the opportunity to do that each year for a while too. If, say, for example, you feel that you are behind on your retirement savings, that would be a strategy we could look at and develop. But again, I'd really just like to take it back to the whole idea of it not really being a cookie cutter answer, and to the point where each individual is going to really have a different situation, and having a discussion with an advisor to really hone in on what's most important to you, what kind of goals do you have, where are you at in your retirement savings, and determining the best course of action.
Great, thank you. So as both of those questions answered, this is a very personalized process, and it really deserves one-on-one attention. It's about you, it's about your money and your goals and what you'd like your future to have. So I think that wraps it up. Thank you all for attending, and have a great weekend.